Broadcasting live from the School of Athens. This is Europe and the People Without History, everyone's favorite AP World History review service. On today's episode with Mr. Olson, we are going to be talking about Period 2, the Classical World, or the Classical Period. The dates for this period are 600 BCE to 600 CE. Generally, what we're talking about is the rise of empires, the rise of religions, and the rise of trans-regional trade networks. Okay, so this video is going to focus on key concept 2.1, which says as states and empires increased in size and contacts between regions intensified, human communities transformed their religious and ideological beliefs and practices. Go ahead and pause me, put that key concept into your own words, and see how you do. Okay, I'm back. And in my own words, I say that as empires grew, religions changed and became more influential. Should be that easy, okay? First big idea in the classical period, religions. Key concept 2.1, Roman numeral 1, codifications and further developments of existing religious traditions provided a bond among people and an ethical code to live by. Okay, the big thing here, and I want you to realize this before we go on any further, is that this is a biggie. Biggie. This is going to be all the religions that you recognize, the ones that have made a profound impact on our modern world. So this one's going to be kind of long. Hopefully they're not all this long, but just wanted to prepare you for what you're in for. Okay, so let's start with the religions that were kind of already bumming around and we touched upon in period 1. The first is going to be Hebrew monotheism, and even though it's not the oldest religion in the world, it's probably the most recognizable, at least to most students living in America. This is, of course, the religion that gets its start with Abraham and the covenant that he makes with God, that he is going to pledge himself, and the Hebrew people will pledge themselves to the one God and begin this faith of monotheism, and God will thus take care of them. That's the covenant. It's a deal that the Hebrews make with God. Their religious text is called the Torah, which is referred to by Christians as the Old Testament. It's written in the Hebrew alphabet, seen here, which is, of course, influenced by the Phoenicians, the first major group to use an alphabet. A key sort of qualifying characteristic of the Hebrews is that they're constantly persecuted against. So the Jewish kingdom, which can be seen down here, which is in near and around modern-day Israel, these purple ones right here show you where the kingdom of the Jews was conquered twice in its many days, once by the Assyrians and then by the Babylonians. But the Babylonian conquering is going to be the more recognizable of the two, seeing as though during that all the Jews are exiled into other areas. So they're sent away from their homeland by a Babylonian king named Nebuchadnezzar, and they're sort of exiled from their homeland. Under the Persians, however, as the Persians practiced cultural and religious tolerance towards the Jews, the Babylonian exile ends and the Jews are able to return to their homeland. However, that of course didn't last, as they were going to be forced out again and again and again, which is sort of the root of the modern day issues that we have there. Reductionist, I realize, but at least it's a connection. Anyways, despite their being moved all over the place, the Jews do retain a strong identity that's related and sort of uses this. The other ancient religion that gets its roots in period 1 is that of Hinduism. Hinduism is started by the Aryans, who bring down a series of religious texts called the Vedas that are written and communicated in Sanskrit, a language that is mastered only by a few in the community. Those few eventually write the Upanishads, which are commentaries on those initial Veda texts, which give us sort of the core tenet for modern day Hinduism. So Hinduism is a polytheistic religion in that it has many gods, but all those gods are reincarnations of the universal soul, or Brahma. So it is kind of confusing, but Hinduism is able to envelop other gods within its pantheon. Some foundational concepts that one should be familiar with when discussing Hinduism is that idea of Brahma, or the universal soul. Also, samsara, which is the reincarnation. That's what happens when one dies. And reincarnation is decided upon by one's ability to follow their duty in life or following their dharma. And then if they follow their dharma well, then they will be reincarnated with a good or favorable karma, which is the idea that sort of you get what you deserve. So the doer of good becomes good, the doer of evil becomes evil. The goal for a Hindu is to reach moksha, which is eternal peace with the universal soul, which is basically freeing yourself from the merry-go-round of samsara or reincarnation and attaining eternal enlightenment. This is done through reincarnation and fulfilling one's dharma. Okay, this is going to give us the roots of the caste system, which arises from a story in the religious texts of Purusha, a universe prevailing god that dies, and then when Purusha dies, his body is split up, his mouth becomes the Brahmin over here, or the priests and the teachers, his arms become the Kshatriyas or the warriors, his thighs become the Vaisyas or the merchants, and his feet become the Shudras or the workers or peasants. And that's going to give us the beginnings of the caste system. You see Hebrew monotheism and Hinduism show up in period 2 in India and the Middle East, so they're important to keep in mind when thinking about the new religions that are going to come onto the scene. Okay, so key concept 2.2 Roman numeral 2 says new belief systems and cultural traditions emerge and spread, often asserting universal truth. So these are going to be reactions to those two religions that we just discussed. First of that is going to be Buddhism. So whenever we're thinking of these new religions, we want to think of the historical context in which they were developed. So the historical context of Buddhism, of course, is a rigid social hierarchy of the caste system that was placed upon people in India by Hinduism. So the Buddha, or the historical figure that becomes the Buddha, is named Siddhartha Gautama, and he's a wealthy prince, and he ventures out of his palace and he realizes 4 things that are going to become known as the 4 noble truths. The first is that all life is suffering, and that suffering is the result of earthly desires and wanting things. Well, you end this earthly desire and wanting things. If you end it, then you will end suffering along with it. In order to do that, you need to follow the Eightfold Path, which I don't have time to get into right now, but just consider as sort of a set of moral guidelines that get you to think and act and look within in the right ways. Now, there's a paradox that's associated with Buddhism here and is often evoked by Westerners to sort of point to inconsistencies in it, and it's the idea that if you're desiring to not want desire, isn't that an example of desire? Well, it's trying to transcend earthly desires, and since attaining nirvana or enlightenment in Buddhism is something that transcends earth, it's not technically considered an earthly desire. That's our easy way around it. One of the important things to remember about Buddhism is that it spreads from a small area very quickly. It spreads 2 ways, 2 main ways, one of which is through the support of a centralized government or leader. That's, of course, Ashoka, the leader of the Mauryan dynasty, who has an epiphany on the battlefield at Kalinga and realizes that death is bad and he's going to seek something better. And so he converts to Buddhism and starts to spread it throughout his empire. The other and probably more pervasive way that Buddhism spreads is through its linkage with merchants along the Silk Road. So since merchants are supported by Buddhist monks, Buddhism gets a good reputation on the Silk Roads, and as you can see by the map, makes its way deep into China and then eventually into Japan and into Southeast Asia. One example of this is this document right here, which you should get to know and love because there's a chance that if you're in any AP World History class, you're going to see it again. If you can tell what's in the middle, it's of course a Buddhist monk, and the Buddhist monk is being praised and given riches by merchants all around him. This indicates that there's a favorable relationship between Buddhism and trade. Buddhists like money because it can help them establish their monasteries and things along the way. Remember, you're trying to transcend earthly desires. That doesn't mean that you can't have any desires. You can't accumulate wealth. You just need to do good things with it. So that shows a favorable relationship between Buddhism and trade. Let's take a field trip over to China and see what philosophical traditions are happening there. The most prevalent is Confucianism, which is a philosophical sort of a moral code or ethical standard that's put forth by Confucius. The historical context of this is the Warring States period that occurs after the delusion of the Zhou dynasty, and this is a period of chaos. And so in response to this chaos, Confucius comes up with this tradition that stresses filial piety or positive relationships with ancestors and elders. The most important relationship is that between a father and a son. If the son respects the father and the father respects the son, then you will have a good functioning society. Confucianism is spread by Confucius's disciples and through a book called the Analects, where Confucius' ideas are written down. It's also adopted, like Buddhism is by Ashoka, by leaders of Chinese dynasties, the most important of which is Han Wudi, one of the first emperors of the Han Dynasty, and his application of Confucian through civil service exams get people throughout China to adopt the philosophical tradition, because if you didn't know Buddhism, you didn't pass a civil service test and you couldn't get a job within the government. In addition, this philosophy is so important because it helps perpetuate the mandate of heaven. If you recall, the mandate of heaven is this idea that if a ruler rules benevolently and positively and with moral values, they will retain the mandate of heaven and stay in power. So Confucius is trying to push those moral behaviors on even emperors to get them to behave well. If they don't behave well, they will lose the mandate of heaven and therefore lose power. Growing up right next to Confucianism is my favorite of Chinese philosophical traditions, and that's Taoism. So Taoism's historical context is exactly the same, this period of chaos known as the Warring States. It's put forth by a philosopher named Lao Tzu, and his major ideas are that humans should seek to maintain harmony between themselves and the natural world. Politics would be altered indirectly. You shouldn't change things intentionally, because that's not the natural way of things. So if you just let things be, they will work themselves out, provided that humans and nature have a positive relationship. Taoism is certainly more free-spirited compared to the rigidness of Confucianism and its political counterpart, legalism, which isn't talked about here, but you probably should revisit it if you don't remember what it is. And it has a pervasive impact on Chinese culture. So if you ever heard of acupuncture, that's a medicinal practice that adopts Taoist ideas. And this architecture right here, which can be seen and is probably recognizable related to China, is the result of Taoist influences. Okay, now if we navigate over to the West, we're going to get their new religion, Christianity. We're going to go through this one kind of quick because, yeah. So the historical context of Christianity is the Roman rule over the Jews, which involved a lot of persecution. The Jews didn't have a lot of freedom, even though they were allowed to practice their religion. It came into contact with their love of the emperor, so oftentimes the Romans came down with a topaz fist on them. And so you get one preacher in the area, or rabbi, named Jesus of Nazareth, and he goes around preaching the ideas of sort of universal salvation for all people, provided that they have faith in one God. He claims to be the messenger of God, the Son of God, and even though during his life he gained some followers, it's really after his death that Christianity spreads like gangbusters. So it spreads due to the work of many missionaries, the most famous of which is Paul of Tarsus, who is a Roman citizen, which allows him to travel throughout the empire spreading the word of Jesus. However, the religion really gets bolstered by the Edict of Milan in the 300 CE, when the Roman Emperor Constantine makes Christianity a legal religion throughout the Roman Empire. He eventually is going to be baptized on his deathbed, paving the way for Christianity to become the major religion of the Roman Empire and then Europe. Okay, key concept 2.1. I know that one was long. Key concept 2.1, Roman numeral 3. Belief systems generally reinforce existing social structures while also offering new roles and status to some men and women. So these new religions kept some things in place and changed some things. There's some incredible vagueness for you. So here's some things that it reinforced. It reinforced existing social structures. So Hinduism reinforced a caste system. Confucianism reinforced ancestor veneration and filial piety. Of course, Confucianism reinforces the gender inequalities, because the relationship with the mother, it wasn't as important as the one with the father, and so males were given a primo role in Confucian society, whereas women were marginalized. However, Christianity and Buddhism are two of the new religions that offer new opportunities to people, especially women. Initially, women, while not allowed to be monks in all areas, were allowed to participate in religious ceremonies more than other. One, you might recall a story of a Christian martyr named Perpetua. She was a woman who um, was saved by Christianity, wrote her ideas down in a diary that was preserved, and we sort of get this as an insight into the religious thoughts of women who were following Christianity at the time. So some change, some stay, some continuity there. And then finally, key concept 2.1, Roman numeral 4. Other religious and cultural traditions continued, and in some places were incorporated into major religious traditions. So the two that we're going to be talking about here, and they're kind of hard to discuss from a Western framework, which is why there's no image available, because of course if we put an image down, that would sort of by default show our Western bias. But these are things that are going to be practiced in places mostly like Africa and the Americas. Animism is the idea that spirits, which are sometimes animals, not all the time though, so don't see anim and then think animal, play a role in regulating day-to-day life. Like I said, African and American civilizations followed this religious doctrine, but also China during the Warring States period, which is one of the things that Lao Tzu and Confucian were responding to, is this sort of idolizing of spirits that guide everyday life. And then the second is shamanism, which is an older religious practice, which is where there are spirit guides on earth that serve as a sort of mediator between humans and the spirit world. So this is especially prevalent in the Chavin civilization in South America, and also during the Warring States period in China. So these are sort of outliers with regard to religious development at the time, but still important things to keep in mind, because people in the Americas and Africa are still people. Okay, that is all I have for key concept 2.1. This is your Buddha signing off.